My name's Louise Devoy and I'm Curator of the Royal Observatory. And so today is Friday the 27th of October 2017 and we're starting to think about changing the clocks. So this time next week we'll be going back to Greenwich Mean Time, GMT. So it'll be a little bit lighter in the morning but darker in the evenings, unfortunately. And then if you move forward to March, when the clocks change again, it will be a little bit different. So you'll have sort of darker mornings and then lighter evenings. So on a personal level, changing the clocks doesn't really seem to make that much of a big deal. It's a little bit inconvenient having to change the clock on your microwave, your video player or DVD player and everything else. But this is something that in some ways that many of us are used to. And if we look at the population as a whole, you'll find that there are quite a few advantages in trying to change the clocks. So for example, it can lower energy consumption, it can reduce the risk of accidents as there's more light and better visibility, and there's some research to suggest that it also improves our health, particularly for kids, as it gives them more time or more daylight to exercise and play outside. So there are lots of advantages. On the flip side, some people think that it's actually more difficult for farmers because it can get much darker in the mornings, they have to change their routines with their livestock and so on. So there are lots of sort of various parts of the debate, and particularly now as we spend so much of our time indoors, in our homes, shops, offices, in our cars, some people are beginning to question, is it really worth it? Are we that dependent on daylight that we need to do all of this? Well, in some ways this is nothing new. Humans have always tried to adapt time to suit their needs. If we go back to the medieval period, people actually used a system of unequal hours. So you would take the total length of daylight, perhaps 8 or 16 hours depending on where you are and the time of the year, and you would divide that into 12 equal units of time. So here in London in the winter that would be about 80 minutes long, whereas in the winter an hour would only be about 40 minutes long. So in this system your hour becomes effectively a percentage of daylight. So for example, if you're at 4 o'clock, that means you're a third of the way through the daylight for the whole day. By 8 o'clock you're about 2/3 and 12 o'clock is then sunset. So it sounds quite complicated and bizarre to us, but for the medieval period it was entirely reasonable because most of your day and your life revolved around daylight, working out in the fields, working on the land. You really needed to know how many hours of daylight do I have left? Have I got enough time to finish my tasks, to walk back home in the light? So it was really essential. But then if you fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, people started moving to the towns and cities and working in factories, where now time becomes money. It determines how long you work in your shift, how much you're paid, and so it's a lot easier to use clock time instead rather than relying on solar time or thinking about daylight. So for clock time you can use something called Greenwich Mean Time, and the idea behind this is that you set up a meridian, so a north-south line, and if you watch the sun moving across this line over the course of a year, you'll notice that it doesn't always cross that meridian at exactly midday or noon. Sometimes it can be up to 15 minutes before or after noon compared to a clock. Now for most of us it's no problem, but obviously for people who need accurate time, like astronomers and mathematicians, this is a real issue. So they averaged out the length of the day across the whole course of the year to create an average or mean. So that's where we get the Greenwich Mean Time from, based on observations taken here at the Royal Observatory. So Greenwich Mean Time is a standard time that was used from that period onwards, from the 17th century onwards. And by the 19th century it became really useful, particularly in relation to the railways. Up until before the early 19th century, people had relied on public clocks that were set to local solar time. So if you're in London it would be midday, but if you're in Norwich it might be say 6 or 10 minutes past 12. If you were down in Plymouth, down in Cornwall, then it would be perhaps sort of 20 minutes later or so. So you have to really sort of juggle the time depending on where you are. But the railways changed all of that. All of a sudden you need to somehow create some way of standardizing time. It's really difficult to create a timetable if every city is on a different time. It just becomes a nightmare and could potentially lead to accidents. So people started using Greenwich Mean Time as is standard across the whole network. And it wasn't until 1880 that Greenwich Mean Time became our legal civil time across the whole country. So people were using it a long time before it actually became a legal necessity. So what's the relationship then between Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, and British Summer Time, BST, the whole reason why we're changing the clocks this weekend? The idea kind of stems from the First World War, when people were trying to save coal supplies. It was sort of realised that the people were using coal for domestic heating and lighting rather than perhaps using it for the war effort in terms of munitions and factories and so on. So it was decided to try and adjust this. The idea itself had been proposed a decade earlier in 1907 by a Kent builder and businessman, William Willett, who had proposed in his pamphlet, A Waste of Daylight, that people needed to adjust their clocks so they could really make the most of the long summer days and really maximise their use of the daylight. He petitioned a long time to try and get this in place, and he had a lot of support, even from prestigious politicians such as Winston Churchill, but it never really came to pass, and sadly he died in 1915. A year later, things started to change, and it was soon realised that the Germans were actually using a sort of daylight saving variation to try and help save their coal supplies as well. And so obviously at the height of the First World War, we didn't want to be beaten by our enemy, and so the British set up their own daylight saving time as well, starting on the 21st of May 1916. Now since then we've played around with British Summer Time. We've had different variations. So for example, during the Second World War we had double summer time, where the clocks were actually shifted by 2 hours, and that really helps give munitions workers walking home from their shift lots of extra daylight to get home. Then in the late 1960s we had continuous summer time. So from 1968 to 1971 the clocks didn't change at all. We were permanently on summertime. But the experiment didn't work too well. There were complaints about some of the dark mornings, and so it changed into the system that we're kind of familiar with today, where we changed the clocks at the end of March and October. This has been in place since 1972, and then it's become adopted across Europe since 2002, and it's still what we use today. So that's the relationship between GMT and BST. And one of the questions that I get asked most here is, well, what does that mean when the clocks change? Do you have to run around the observatory changing all the clocks? And actually we have it quite easy here. We don't really change that many clocks, and it's a deliberate decision. One of our most famous clocks is the Shepherd Gate clock, which once received electrical impulses from a master clock that was held here in the basement. It would send these impulses through to the clock by the front gates, which is effectively known as a slave dial. It sort of responds to the signals. And we keep it on GMT all year round, which often confuses our visitors, particularly in the summer. They get here and they find that it's an hour behind, which seems really puzzling. But it's a deliberate decision because obviously British Summer Time had not been in place by that time. The clock was installed in 1852, so a good half century before British Summer Time really came into effect. And the clock itself is really a legacy of the Great Exhibition. The 7th Astronomer Royal, George Bidlary, had been to visit the exhibition and had seen an electrical impulse clock by Charles Shepherd on display. And he realised that this would be a really good way of distributing observatory time, Greenwich Mean Time, to lots of different people. Particularly thinking again about the railway networks and how you could have all these clocks working in sync, connected by a telegraph network that would send out all these signals. So AIRI commissioned the Shepherd clock, and it's been here. It was ticking away as the beating heart of GMT, as it's sometimes known, and that was sending the signals to our Shepherd master clock. It's a really great piece, and I would strongly welcome you to come and visit the observatory and take a look for yourself to see the Shepherd Gate clock on the outside. If you come inside, you can find out more about the meridians that we use to define Greenwich Mean Time, GMT. You can also see our Harrison timekeepers and other amazing telescopes and clocks that really helped us take time from the stars and the sun and convert it into clock time. We will remember to change our clocks on Saturday night, and we will be open on Sunday at 10 a.m. Hope you'll come and join us.